That's roughly how long it's taken me to take this idea and turn it into a fully functioning application. But to understand why that is, we need to rewind a bit. Late July, I got a call from my friend. I have an idea for an app, she says. So I pick up my pen, ready to turn this idea into a money-making machine. A few hours go by, the initial excitement wears off, and that idea ends up with all the ones before it. What if this was the one? I kept thinking to myself. So this time, I decided to do something I'd never done before. Take action. The idea itself is quite simple. All the features that you need to manage a trip in one place. For the MVP, this meant document storage, an activity calendar, and an expense tracker. I was hesitant to even work on this project because I was afraid it would be a waste of my time. But I had some time to think about it, and here's how I look at this. If this project flops, not only do I still have all the knowledge I've gained in the process, but I now have a really cool project to add to my portfolio. If this project succeeds, however, I might just have a product turned company on my hands, but that's for another video. Now let's talk about the very first stage in this whole process, which is the design phase, taking the idea from paper and visualizing it before I even start writing any code. Although I consider myself somewhat of a creative, putting designs together is not exactly where I shine. I would spend weekends, early mornings, late nights trying to gather whatever inspiration I could. You see, the issue is I can be a bit of a perfectionist, and to show you what I mean, pay attention to this design. It's going to be important later on. Despite my questionable design skills, I managed to put something together that I was happy with, and that meant I can move on to the next stage of this process, the development phase. When I wrote the first lines of code for this project, I started off using JavaScript with no framework, just vibes. And I quickly realized why this was a terrible idea. Essentially, I tried to build a house without a blueprint. Fast forward a couple days and I encountered problem number 2. Take this pagination component for example. It can be incredibly cumbersome having to build this alongside many other components that you need to have a fully functional application. I searched and searched the entire web trying to find a solution to this issue, and it appeared that every solution I came across was all but perfect. And as you can probably tell by now, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I came to know of a components library built by Google called Materials UI. At this point, I could practically smell the finish line. Just a couple more hundred lines of code and I would be done, right? Wrong. Remember when I told you to pay attention to that design? Well, here is what that product looks like today. Do you notice anything different? You will quickly realize that this final design bears no resemblance whatsoever to the initial concept. Why don't we take a second to finally talk about what went right and how this product actually looks as of the time I'm recording this video. 3 functions split across 3 pages. Number 1 is the diary page, and the whole idea for this page is to be an interface where you're able to view and keep track of your planned activities for a given trip. One thing you'll notice is the calendar updates instantaneously, and this is done through a process called optimistic update. I update the data that you see in front of you, the front end, even before we get a successful response for the back end. And the implication of that is, irregardless of how slow or fast your network speed is, the app will always feel instantaneous and feel more reactive, which I think is a pretty neat user experience. Number 2 is the expenses page. Now, this is my second favorite page by design. You have a budget and you have an expenses component. That way you can get a quick overview of what your current expenditure is and how much more of your budget you can afford to spend. Eventually, when I introduce collaborative features, you'll also then be able to split expenses with other trip members right in this interface as well. Last but not least, we have the overview page, and as the name suggests, it's simply a summary of all the details of your trip put into a single page with the added functionality of a checklist as well as your document storage. Now that you know what the application does, let's talk about the underlying technologies. In other words, the tech stack. First, let's talk about the part that you get to see, the front end. My front end is actually built using a couple of technologies. So my framework is Next.js, my state management is handled using Redux, and the data fetching and caching is handled using Redux Toolkit Query, which I fell in love with, by the way. Earlier I mentioned that I started off using React with no framework, but when I realized the benefits of using Next.js, it was a no-brainer moving over. And lastly, let's talk about the part that you don't get to see, the backend. My framework of choice is Django, and I chose that for its simplicity and also because it's the one I'm most familiar with. The documents are currently hosted on Amazon's object storage service, that's AWS S3, and everything else is hosted locally on a Postgres database. And finally, the authentication is handled simply using JSON Web Tokens. As you can see, not a very complex tech stack, but it gets the job done. Initially, I honestly thought this product was more of a vitamin than a painkiller. But if you think about it, when Airbnb launched, they had a similar thought, and what they figured was just a little website turned out to be a company worth over $80 billion. So you never know. You just might be looking at the next Brian Chesky. Okay, fine. I'm getting ahead of myself, but you can't stop me from dreaming. That's been my process building this application. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.